Mail-order bride unlocked a secret room and found the bloody gowns of her husband's dead wives. The town of Frontier Creek was a deceptively peaceful place, a sun-bleached painting of order, but beneath the dust it exuded a quiet unease, thick with hushed secrets and a simmering cruelty. Amos, the town's carriage repairman, hammered a loose spoke back into place. His movements were methodical, his face a mask of focus, but his eyes kept drifting to the Blackwood Manor on the hill. Specifically to the giant kiln at its edge, its chimney always breathing a thin, greasy smoke. The new mail-order bride Rose had arrived that morning, pretty as a peach. Amos had seen 3 others just like her in the last 4 years. They all arrived smiling. None of them ever left. He had smelled a rat for years, a stench worse than burnt clay. As he worked, he found something caught in the carriage's axle grease, a small silver locket warped by intense heat. He opened it. It was empty. The picture inside had been burned away. This wasn't just another victim. This was a warning. The world outside the carriage window had bled from green to gold, and finally to a shimmering sun-bleached expanse of dust and promise. For Rose, the final miles to Frontier Creek were a prayer whispered against the rhythmic rattle of the wheels. The letters in her lap, tied with a faded ribbon, spoke of a new life, of a fine gentleman named Rowland Blackwood, of a home carved from the wild heart of the West. They spoke of a future. And then she saw it. The town rose from the plains like a mirage, too perfect to be real. The main street was swept clean, the wooden facades of the mercantile and saloon painted in fresh, hopeful colors. It was a town scrubbed of its sins. At the end of the street a man stood waiting. Rowland Blackwood was taller than his letters suggested, his shoulders broad beneath a tailored frock coat. His smile was a slow, easy thing that seemed to calm the wind itself. As Rose stepped down her legs, trembling from the journey, he swept his hat from his head and presented a single, perfect crimson rose. "Welcome, my dear Rose," he said, his voice a low, rich baritone. "Welcome to your home." It's beautiful, Mr. Blackwood." She managed her voice a shy whisper as she took the flower. Its thorns had been carefully clipped away. "Please, it is Rowland," he corrected gently, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "And this is all for you. A new beginning for us both." He offered his arm, and as they began the slow walk toward the grand manor that crested the highest hill, Rose felt the town's gaze upon her. People smiled and nodded from their porches, but the smiles never quite reached their eyes. A woman in front of the bakery pulled her young daughter close, her friendly wave dissolving as soon as Rose passed. It felt like a performance, a well-rehearsed welcome. Her gaze was drawn to the manor itself, a testament to wealth and power. But beside it, stark and industrial, stood a colossal brick kiln, its tall chimney breathing a thin, constant stream of greasy smoke into the pristine blue sky. It felt wrong. "What a curious structure," Rose remarked, unable to hide her surprise. Rowland's hand came to rest on the small of her back, a warm, guiding pressure. "A new venture, my love. Pottery. I believe even a place as rugged as this deserves artistry," he said smoothly, his voice a balm on her fleeting unease. He steered her toward the grand oak doors of the manor. "But that is a dull matter for another day. Today is for you." She let him guide her, the sweet scent of the rose in her hand overwhelming the faint acrid smell that drifted from the chimney. From the cool, oil-scented shadows of his workshop, Amos watched them. He saw the new bride, her face a pale flower of hope, and he saw the wolf dressed in his finest Sunday wool, leading her to the slaughter. Amos hammered a heated iron rim onto a new wagon wheel, the sharp ringing blows a punctuation to his dark thoughts. He had been in Frontier Creek for 4 years. 4 years of watching, of listening. 4 years was long enough to see a pattern. He remembered Eleanor, the bride from 2 years ago, the one with a laugh like wind chimes. She was gone in less than a year. Then came Maeve, who read books under the cottonwood tree. 6 months. The last one, a quiet Swedish girl named Ingrid, hadn't even lasted 4. Each time the story from the manor was the same. The frontier was too harsh for her delicate spirit. She went back east. No one ever saw them leave. The lie was wearing thin, but Blackwood's gold was a powerful glue holding the town's silence together. Amos had suspected, had felt a cold dread coil in his gut, but he was just a blacksmith, a carriage mender, a man with dirty hands and no standing. What could he do against a king? Late that afternoon, Blackwood's elegant carriage was rolled into his workshop for a pre-wedding polish. "Mr. Blackwood wants it gleaming," the stable hand said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near the door. "For the drive tomorrow." Amos just nodded his silence, a heavy cloak. He worked his movements methodical. He polished the brass lamps, oiled the axles, checked the leather harnesses. It was under the driver's velvet seat cushion that he found it. A small silver brooch shaped like a swallow. It was bent and its surface was dulled, stained with a smoky residue. He knew the brooch. He'd seen Eleanor fiddle with it as she spoke of her home in Ohio. The air left his lungs. This was no longer suspicion. This was proof. A piece of a ghost in the palm of his hand. That night, sleep would not come. The glow from the kiln on the hill pulled at him a malevolent star. He walked, keeping to the shadows, his heart a heavy, frightened drum. As he neared the estate, he saw a lone figure, one of Blackwood's hired men, heaving a heavy wooden crate toward the kiln's fiery mouth. The figure tossed it in, and the flames roared hungrily. Amos waited until the man was gone before he dared to approach the mound of cooling ash near the kiln's base. The heat was still intense. He poked at the gray mound with a stick, the air thick with the smell of scorched earth and something else. Something sickly sweet. A glint of white caught the moonlight. He knelt his calloused fingers, carefully digging it out of the soot. It was a single button carved from mother of pearl, the kind found on a wedding dress. It was cracked clean in two from the heat. He stood there in the dark, the silent manor looming above him. In one hand he held a dead woman's brooch, in the other a dead woman's button. And in his mind he saw the hopeful, trusting face of Rose, who was at this very moment sleeping in the gilded cage, dreaming of a future that had already been reduced to ash. The days that followed were draped in sun-drenched silk and silent, suffocating dread. Rowland Blackwood's manor was a masterpiece of curated beauty, a world of polished mahogany crystal glasses that chimed with the slightest touch and air that hung still and heavy, trapping the scent of beeswax and secrets. For Rose, it was a beautiful cage. Blackwood was an attentive captor. He gifted her a dress of emerald satin, a string of pearls that felt cold against her skin. They were not gifts, they were costumes. He was dressing a doll for a play only he understood. Her questions about his past, about the town, about the ever-burning kiln, were met with a charming laugh and a gentle redirection that was as effective as a locked door. "I thought perhaps I would walk into town today," she ventured one afternoon, the stillness of the house pressing in on her, "to see the shops." Blackwood, who had been reading by the fire, looked up. His smile was warm, but his eyes were not. "Nonsense, my dear. A lady of your standing shouldn't trouble herself with such trivialities. Anything you desire, I will have it brought to you. Your place is here, safe, with me." His word was law. Her world shrank to the gilded walls of the manor. Her focus narrowed to a single point of fixation, the heavy oak door at the end of the west wing corridor. It was always locked. No sound ever came from it. No light shone from beneath it. It was a void in the heart of the house, a place where questions went to die. She would stand before it, her hand hovering over the cold brass knob, a terrible curiosity warring with a primal fear. She knew she had to get out. The excuse when it came to her was a stroke of desperate genius. The intricate beading on her wedding gown she claimed had a clasp that had come loose near the bodice. It required a fine, strong hand, a tool more delicate than a sewing needle. Perhaps the carriage maker she suggested her voice a carefully constructed performance of bridal anxiety. Amos, I believe his name is a man who works so intricately with leather and brass, must have the right tools. Blackwood considered it. For a moment, his eyes hardened a flicker of suspicion. But to deny such a small, reasonable request so close to their wedding day would seem churlish. He relented. "Very well," he said, his smile returning. "But do not tarry, my love. I find I cannot bear to have you out of my sight for long." Amos was shaping a new hickory, spoke the blade of his draw knife, peeling away clean white curls of wood. He worked not just with his hands, but with his mind, trying to shape the ugly thoughts that had taken root there. The swallow brooch and the pearl button were wrapped in a leather scrap hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his workshop. They felt heavier than any anvil. He took a piece of charcoal and on a spare plank of pine began to sketch. He was no artist, but the faces came back to him. Eleanor with her wide, laughing eyes. Maeve, her expression serious, thoughtful. Ingrid, her face pale with a quiet, constant fear. 3 women in 4 years. The timeline was a death sentence, and it was accelerating. Rose, he knew, had less time than any of them. The soft chime of the bell above his door startled him. It was her. Rose stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon light, looking entirely out of place amidst the sweat sawdust and iron of his world. He saw the polite smile on her face, but he also saw the frantic desperation in her eyes. It was the same look Ingrid had worn in her final weeks. "Mr. Blackwood sent me," she said, her voice softer than he'd imagined. She explained her flimsy pretext, holding up the gown. "My dress. A clasp has come loose." Amos wiped his hands on his leather apron, taking the heavy gown from her. His knuckles brushed her trembling fingers. He played along his voice a low rumble. "Of course, ma'am. I'll take a look. Some things, they look strong on the outside, but the stitching is weak. Can come apart under pressure." He felt her gaze on him, sharp and intelligent. "Yes," she said, a world of meaning in the single word. "It feels very fragile." He didn't look up from his work, pretending to examine the clasp. "This is hard country, ma'am. It's not for everyone. Some folks find they can't stay." He paused, letting the words hang in the dusty air. "And this town. It has a way of holding on to people, whether they want to be held or not." The silence that followed was charged. He could hear her sharp intake of breath. "What if someone wants to leave?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but can't. Amos finally looked up, meeting her terrified gaze directly. He saw a flicker of the fighter in her, the survivor. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and firm, a promise and a warning. "A good carriage, ma'am, can take you anywhere you need to go. You just have to know when it's time to ride." He quickly mended the clasp with a pair of fine pliers, his movements sure and steady. He handed the gown back to her, and this time their fingers clasped for a brief intentional second. A pact was made. A silent alliance forged in shared fear. She returned to the manor, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. For the first time, she felt a sliver of hope. That night, the hope died. Unable to sleep, she stood at her window, gazing at the moon-silvered grounds. A figure emerged from a side door of the house. It was Blackwood. He was not carrying a crate. He was dragging something heavy. It was the large leather-bound traveling trunk she had arrived with, the one that held all her belongings, her letters, her life from before. She watched in cold, silent horror as he dragged it across the manicured lawn, a dark scar on the perfect grass heading directly for the relentless, ever-glowing kiln. He was erasing her. He was burning her past to make way for her ashes. Her wedding was in 2 days. She now knew she would not live to see it. Terror gave way to a cold, hard resolve. The secret of the West Wing, she had to know what it was. She had to know what she was truly up to against. Tonight. The Manor was a tomb of silence. Rowland Blackwood had ridden into town, a smile on his lips, to finalize the arrangements for their wedding. That was the lie he told her. Rose knew the truth. The image of her own traveling trunk being dragged toward the hungry, glowing mouth of the kiln was burned into her mind. He wasn't preparing for a wedding. He was clearing the stage for a funeral. This was her only chance. His study was a cage of masculine scents, old leather, sweet cigar smoke, and the faint, sharp smell of whiskey. It was the lair of a well-dressed predator. She did not hesitate. Her hands, shaking but determined, flew to the drawers of his great mahogany desk. In the third drawer, beneath a map of his vast land holdings, lay a heavy ring of iron keys. They felt cold, like unearthed bones in her palm. The walk down the West Wing corridor was a journey into a forgotten land. Dust motes danced like frantic spirits in the thin shafts of light. The portraits of Blackwood's ancestors, their painted eyes dark and severe, seemed to follow her, their silent judgment a weight on her shoulders. The air grew cold, stale. The silence here was different. It was a dead silence. She reached the door. The final door. It stood like a headstone. Her breath hitched as she tried the first key. It grated but did not turn. The second. Nothing. The sound of metal scraping in the lock was a scream in the quiet hall. On the 5th try, there was a deep, guttural clunk. The lock yielded. For a heart-stopping moment, she stood frozen, her hand on the knob. Then she pushed the door open. It did not creak. It swung inward with a dreadful, oiled smoothness. The room was not a dusty attic. It was a shrine, a gallery of ghosts. Her first thought was of the smell, a faint, cloying mix of lavender-dried flowers and something else. Something like old paper and deeper decay. The light from the single grime-caked window was weak, but it was enough. Enough to see the women. They stood in a silent, orderly line along the length of the vast room. Pale and still. Mannequins. Dozens of them. And each one wore a wedding dress. A gasp, sharp and painful, escaped her lips. She took a stumbling step inside her mind, refusing to process the scene. The dresses were a history of fashion, some with high lace collars and delicate seed pearls, others with simpler homespun elegance. Each one was immaculate, preserved as if for a bride who had just stepped out of it. This wasn't a memorial. It was a collection. Her horror drew her forward down the line of silent brides. Beside each mannequin stood a small polished table, and on each table lay the artifacts of a life neatly arranged. A leather-bound diary, a small stack of letters tied with ribbon, and a single telling object, a silver hairbrush, its bristles still holding a few strands of auburn hair. A pair of spectacles, one lens cracked. A small, intricately carved wooden bird. Her trembling fingers reached out to a music box on one of the tables. She nudged its tiny lever. A tinny, discordant melody plinked out into the dead air, a broken lullaby. The sound was a desecration. It was too loud. She slammed the lid shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to know. She picked up the diary beside the music box. The first page was written in a looping, optimistic script. September 14th. Rowland is the most charming man I have ever known. He says he will build me a life fit for a queen. Rose flipped through the pages. The handwriting grew frantic, jagged. The ink was spattered. October 29th. He watches me. He is always watching. The door is always locked. He says it is for my safety. I think I am in a beautiful prison. God help me. Rose dropped the book. It hit the floor with a soft, final thud. Her gaze swept the room, counting. 20, 30, more. a lifetime of murder, a legacy of horror hidden behind a handsome smile. Then she saw it, at the very end of the long, terrible line, an empty mannequin, its plaster form pale and waiting. Beside it, an empty table, and on the table a small newly engraved silver plaque. It reflected the dim light, the letters sharp and clear. It read, Rose. A floorboard creaked in the corridor. She froze, every muscle in her body turning to ice. He was back. He had never been in town. He had been waiting. He had been testing her. The doorknob turned, the door swung open, and Rowland Blackwood filled the frame, a dark silhouette against the light of the hall. He looked at her, at the open diary on the floor, at her face, a mask of pure terror. The charming smile he always wore was gone, replaced by an expression of serene, chilling ownership. "I see you've found the gallery, my dear," he said, his voice as calm and pleasant as if he were remarking on the weather. "I do hope you approve. I've been saving that space just for you." "You're a monster," she whispered the words barely audible, her feet stumbling backward into the forest of dead brides. He stepped into the room, his presence sucking the very air from it. "A monster. No," he corrected, his voice dangerously soft. "I am a connoisseur, a collector of moments. I appreciate beauty in its purest, most perfect form, that hopeful, trusting light in a bride's eyes on her arrival, before it becomes complicated, before the questions start, before the tiresome, flawed reality of a person sets in." He gestured around the room, a museum curator displaying his prized possessions. They were all so beautiful. Just like you. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing the final closing of a coffin lid. The room plunged into a deeper, more intimate darkness. "Don't look so frightened," Blackwood murmured, taking a deliberate step toward her. "You'll still have your wedding. A union of fire and ash." He smiled, then a true smile, and it was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. "You will be my most beautiful bride yet." He lunged. The world shrank to the confines of the dusty lavender-scented room, to the space between predator and prey. When Blackwood lunged, it was not with the frantic rage of a common brute, but with the smooth, practiced efficiency of a butcher. His hands, which had felt so gentle on hers, closed around her arm like iron manacles. Primal terror gave way to a blinding, furious need to live. Rose was not a doll to be placed on a shelf. She screamed a raw, ragged sound that was swallowed by the thick walls and the ghostly wedding gowns. She kicked her boot, connecting sharply with his shin. He grunted, surprised by her defiance, his grip momentarily slackening. She twisted free, stumbling backward, her hand scrabbling across one of the small polished tables. Her fingers closed around something heavy, solid. A silver-backed hairbrush, ornate and cool to the touch. Such fire, Blackwood mused, a cruel admiration in his eyes as he advanced on her again. "All my brides have it at the end. It makes the final moments so memorable." He lunged again, and she swung the heavy brush with all her might. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. He staggered, a dark bloom of crimson appearing at his temple. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of his shocked, sharp intake of breath. The monster could bleed, but it only enraged him. His face contorted, the mask of the gentleman utterly burned away, leaving only a snarling demon. He backhanded her the force of the blow, sending her sprawling to the floor, the silver brush clattering among the silent mannequins. He loomed over her, grabbing a fistful of her hair, and began to drag her from the mausoleum. "The kiln is too good for you now," he snarled, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "You will have a slower end." He dragged her down the cold, dark corridor. Each scrape of her shoes on the floor was a countdown to her death. She closed her eyes, a sob catching in her throat. And that's when she heard it. A low, rhythmic thundering. a sound that didn't belong in the dead silence of the house. It grew louder, a frantic galloping beat. Hoofbeats, the groan of heavy wheels on hard-packed earth moving impossibly fast. Blackwood heard it too. He paused, his head cocked, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. What new devilry is this? Amos saw the world in shades of red. The red of rage. The red of a woman's blood about to be spilled. The ghosts of Eleanor, Maeve, and Ingrid rode with him, their silent screams urging his horses on. He stood on the driver's seat of the heavy four-wheel freight wagon, the reins wrapped tight around his raw knuckles, his face a mask of cold, righteous fury. He was not aiming for the Manor's grand entrance. He was aiming for the wall of the carriage house, the weakest point, the place that would bring him closest to the West Wing. No more, the thought hammered in his mind with every beat of the horse's hooves. Not this one. The great house loomed before him, a dark fortress of sin. He let out a wordless roar, a sound torn from the very depths of his soul, and cracked the whip. The horses, smelling his desperation, gave one last powerful surge. For Rose being dragged down the hallway, the world simply exploded. The entire side wall of the corridor vanished in a deafening, splintering cataclysm of wood plaster and dust. Sunlight, thick with swirling debris, flooded the dark passage, and framed in the ragged hole like a vengeful god emerging from a storm cloud, sat Amos on the wreckage of his wagon, his face set like granite. "Rose," he roared, his voice cutting through the ringing in her ears. "Run!" Blackwood stood frozen for a fatal second, his mind unable to comprehend the violation. That single second was all Rose needed. She twisted, biting down hard on the hand that held her hair, and scrambled free. She ran, not looking back, scrambling over the shattered timber and broken furniture toward the impossible sight of her savior. "You!" Blackwood bellowed, his shock turning to apoplectic rage. The blacksmith. "You worthless peasant, you'll hang for this!" Hired hands were swarming from the main house, now alerted by the crash. Amos grabbed Rose, pulling her up onto the wagon beside him. He whipped the reins, and the heavy wagon, groaning in protest, lurched forward away from the chaos and out toward the main gates. A gunshot cracked behind them, then another. They were free of the manor, thundering down the hill into the seemingly safe embrace of Frontier Creek. Hope, fragile and bright, bloomed in Rose's chest. They would find help. The sheriff would protect them. But as they reached the main street, the townspeople emerged from their shops and homes, not with concern, but with cold, hard faces. Doors were shut. Windows were shuttered. The sheriff stepped into the middle of the street, a heavy Colt in his hand, blocking their path. He was not alone. A dozen other men, faces grim, stood with him. Sheriff Amos yelled, his voice raw with disbelief. "For God's sake, help us! Blackwood is a murderer!" The sheriff's gaze was as dead and empty as a winter sky. "The only trouble I see here is you, Amos." He set his voice flat. "Causing a disturbance. And it appears you're abducting Mr. Blackwood's bride-to-be." Rose's fragile hope shattered. They weren't just running from a man. They were running from the whole town. Amos wrenched the wagon into a narrow side alley, a desperate attempt to find another way out. It was a dead end. They were trapped. The sheriff and his posse advanced from the front. Moments later, the sound of horses behind them announced the arrival of Blackwood and his own men sealing their tomb. Blackwood dismounted, his face a mask of triumphant fury, the bleeding gash on his temple making him look truly demonic. He savored the moment, seeing the absolute despair on their faces. He turned to a man on a fast-looking horse. "Ride back to the manor," he screamed, his voice echoing in the narrow alley, a command for all the town to hear. "Burn it. Burn the West Wing to the ground. I want nothing left." No proof. The rider spurred his horse, galloping away to carry out the order. Blackwood turned back to them, a slow, terrible smile spreading across his face. He had them. He would erase his past and eliminate his present all at once. As he raised his pistol, a new shadow began to fall over the alley, a strange, premature twilight. Rose looked up. From the direction of the manor, a thick, greasy column of black smoke was billowing into the sky, a funeral pyre for the ghosts of the women he had killed. The alley was a tomb, sealed at both ends. Blackwood's order to burn the evidence was a death sentence, not just for the past, but for them. In the sudden suffocating silence between his command and their capture, Amos looked at Rose. He saw no more tears. Her terror had been forged into something harder, something as sharp and brittle as glass. He saw her terrified, desperate nod. It was all he needed. "Hi-yah!" He roared a primal sound of pure defiance. He cracked the whip over the heads of the horses, and the heavy freight wagon, their prison, became a battering ram. For a moment, the sheriff and his posse stood frozen in disbelief, their confident smirks turning to masks of panic. They scattered like chickens, diving behind water troughs and into doorways as tons of wood and iron bore down on them. The wagon hit their flimsy blockade with a sound like a thunderclap splintering timber and sending men sprawling. A bullet screamed past Amos's ear, a hornet of hot lead. They were through. They were free of the alley, bursting onto the main street and into the maw of a new and terrible hell. The world dissolved. The smoke from the burning west wing did not rise, it fell. It descended upon Frontier Creek not as a cloud, but as a plague, a thick, choking torrent of hot ash and soot that swallowed the sky. The sun vanished. The world turned to a suffocating monochromatic gray, lit only by the distant hellish orange glow of the fire they had fled. It was a snowstorm in July, and the snow was the ashes of dead women. "I can't see," Rose screamed, her voice swallowed by the rising roar of the wind. The air was a razor in her throat, thick with grit that stung her eyes and clogged her lungs. Through the gray, swirling chaos, a shape materialized, a rider, his face a ghostly blur, his pistol raised. Amos wrenched the wagon hard to the left, the wheels groaning in protest. The shot went wide, a flash of red in the gloom. He didn't have to see. He had to feel. The ruts of the road, the incline of a street, the memory of the town's layout was his only map in this blinding nightmare. Rose, her mind sharp with adrenaline, tore a long, clean strip from the hem of her petticoat. She leaned over, tying one half of the fabric firmly over Amos's mouth and nose, then secured the other half over her own. The simple act was an anchor in the madness, a testament to a will that refused to be extinguished. She was no longer a victim being rescued. She was a partner in a desperate war. She clung to the lurching wagon seat, her eyes straining, trying to give shape to the monstrous shadows that flitted in and out of the gray veil. "Amos Wright!" she shrieked, pointing to a fleeting silhouette. "Another rider, hold on," he roared back, pulling the reins, guiding the terrified horses down a narrow side street he knew by heart. The sounds of pursuit grew muffled, confused. They were a ghost in a storm of their own making. They were hunted, but their hunters were just as blind, firing at sounds, at memories, at phantoms in the ash. Amos risked a sharp turn behind the old abandoned tannery, a place whose stench would help mask their own. The horses heaved their great chests, shuddering their dark coats, now a uniform spectral gray. In the relative shelter of the building, the roar of the wind lessened to a mournful howl. They huddled together, gasping for breath through the cloth masks, two survivors on a small wooden island in a sea of ash. "Are they still behind us?" Rose asked, her voice a raw, ragged whisper. Amos was still, his head cocked, listening past the wind. He could hear scattered shouts, the distant panicked whinny of a horse. They're scattered. Blind, just like us. He looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed and fierce, meeting hers in the dim orange light. But Blackwood, he won't stop. He's like a rabid dog on a scent. He'll hunt us till dawn. Rose's gaze followed his out past the shelter of the tannery toward the angry, pulsing glow that was the source of their apocalyptic storm. The fire, the kiln, the beginning and the end of it all. Her fear was a cold, hard stone in her gut, but beside it a new feeling was taking root. A cold, hard anger. He saw the change in her face. He saw the fire in her eyes now match the one on the horizon. He pointed a trembling soot-stained finger toward the glow, his voice raspy but clear, a desperate plan forging itself in the crucible of their flight. There he said, "The fire he started." He met her gaze, and she knew what he was going to say before he said it. She gave a single sharp nod. "That's where we end it." Amos let out a sharp cry, cracking the whip once more. The exhausted horses, sensing the grim finality in his voice, surged forward, pulling the heavy wagon from its hiding place and plunging back into the heart of the storm. They were no longer running away from the fire. They were riding straight into it. They rode into the belly of the beast. The kiln was a roaring, malevolent furnace, its orange glare cutting through the swirling gray ash like the eye of a dragon. The heat was a physical blow, baking the very air they breathed. Amos did not slow. He guided the wagon onto a narrow wooden trestle, a rickety bridge of timber that ran directly past the kiln's open, fiery mouth. It was a path to salvation or a path to hell. Behind them, a shape tore through the ash. Blackwood. His face was a demonic mask of soot and dried blood, his eyes burning with a mad, obsessive light. He was alone, having outpaced his own men in his single-minded pursuit. "You cannot escape my world," he roared, his voice a ragged tear in the fabric of the storm. His pistol barked. The bullet splintered the wood inches from Amos's head. They were drawing level with the inferno now, the roar of the flames a deafening thunder. This was it, the final gamble. Amos yelled. Now he slammed his foot on the wagon's heavy brake. The iron wheels locked, and with a guttural roar he wrenched the reins. The massive freight wagon fishtailed its heavy rear corners, swinging out like a club and smashing into the side of Blackwood's lighter, faster carriage. The impact was catastrophic. Blackwood's carriage teetered, two wheels spinning uselessly over the abyss. Rose, her face a mask of cold fury, grabbed the heavy iron wrench from the toolbox at her feet. With a final vengeful scream, she hurled it with all her strength, not at Blackwood, but at his panicked horses. It was enough. The horses reared in terror, pulling the carriage sideways. It balanced for a heart-stopping second on the edge of the trestle, and then it toppled. Wood splintered, a man screamed, and the entire carriage plunged directly into the roaring white-hot maw of the kiln. The fire devoured it whole. The scream was cut short, consumed by the flames. Silence descended, broken only by the whisper of the dying fire and the settling ash. As the first clean rays of dawn pierced the gray clouds, Amos and Rose turned their wagon around. They did not look back. They rode away from the ruins, two battered survivors on a scarred landscape, leaving the monster to be buried in the ashes of his own making. Justice was served by fire, and from the ashes of Frontier Creek, two scarred souls have found a new path. But the question remains, what's more terrifying, a monster like Blackwood, who shows his face, or an entire town that stays silent about his sins to keep their pockets full? If the harrowing escape of Rose and Amos gripped your heart, don't hesitate to hit that like button and leave your answer in the comment section below. And don't you go anywhere, because next week we're riding headlong into an even fiercer tale: The Horse Wrangler and the Phantom Steed. A girl is sentenced to death by her own brother to be dragged across the desert, but she survived and is returning on the back of a legend to reclaim her justice. Make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell now so you don't miss a single second of her thunderous revenge,